I hate Black Lives Matter. And the main reason I hate them is not because they were inspired by a cop-killing terrorist, not because they walk down the street chanting that they want dead cops. But the main reason I hate Black Lives Matter is because of the name itself. And I'll explain to you why. The name is a massive trap right from the get-go. So if you disagree with the things that Black Lives Matter do, which I do, it's very difficult to express that disagreement without sounding like a massive racist. So if you say I hate Black Lives Matter, it makes it sound like you disagree with the idea that black lives are important and that black lives deserve to be, as opposed to hating the political entity or the group that is Black Lives Matter. So I'll be the first one to break the taboo. I hate Black Lives Matter. I can't stand them. I'd like to see Black Lives Matter eradicated. Which doesn't sound too good. But from now on, what I'm going to do to distinguish between the idea that black lives are important and the group that is Black Lives Matter, I'm going to call them Black Lives Matter trademark from now on. So there's absolutely no confusion. And so I can completely negate that trap that's deliberately set to shut down conversation. This is where I think ISIS went wrong personally, because could you imagine if ISIS had called themselves Muslims for Equality? You know, they would have won the jihad before they even cut off a single head or bombed a single concert, you know? Because we'd be so busy tying ourselves in knots over the name Muslims for Equality that we probably would refuse to even talk about them. I mean, as it was, we fussed over the name ISIS because it contained the word Islamic, and so we thought it was representative of all Muslims, even though nobody actually said that. But yeah, could you imagine if they were called, I hate Muslims for Equality, you know? Or, oh, did you hear what Muslims for Equality did? Oh, I'd like to see someone shoot them. Or, imagine if they were called All Muslims, if ISIS was just called All Muslims. I hate all Muslims. You know, I'd like to see all Muslims shot. We'd be screwed. Someone's probably going to take that well badly out of context, but whatever. So getting back to Black Lives Matter trademark, the other thing that I hate about them is they are so unreasonable, and the people supporting them are so unreasonable that they've forced me, in order for me not to be a hypocrite, they forced me to defend Derek Chauvin's right to a free trial, a fair trial. They forced me to defend the police, which I'm no fan of the police. And so now I have to defend a 17th century slave trader because things have got that unreasonable that I have to do it because it doesn't seem like anyone else is going to do it. So, yeah. So, let's get to it, shall we?
Good morning. It's 3 minutes after 10 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC.
Now, this was a show of James O'Brien's that happened a couple of days ago, and he's talking about this statue that got ripped down in Bristol and thrown into the river. And I did actually try and call him on that day, but he must have remembered what happened last time I called him because I didn't manage to get through. So, yeah. So what I've done, I've decided that I'll respond to him this way instead, and I've clipped out a few key parts of his 15-minute ramble that he does at the start of each one of his shows that I want to respond to in particular. So, let's go.
If ever there were an issue that Brooks know both sidesism, it would be slavery, right? You would have thought that a few years ago. What are you going to do today, James, at work? Well, we're probably going to take some calls from people who are quite comfortable with slavery or who think that statues of slavers have a right and proper place in the middle of British cities where lots of descendants of slaves live.
Spoiler alert, he takes no such call. And also, to equate supporting slavery with supporting a statue, two very different things in my opinion, but there you go.
The simple response to this, given that nobody was hurt and nobody's going to miss the statue, I think the simple response is, I really do think this. If you want to find out what somebody thinks about slavery, ask them what they think about this statue.
Now, I watched an interview on Sky News about a guy who was defending this statue, and I'll show you it now.
I'm not a supporter in removing historical monuments.
Now, I know what James O'Brien would be thinking if he saw this interview. He'd be thinking, oh my God, this guy is the most racist person of all time. He must love slavery. He must own 10 plantations with loads of black people being slaves on it. Oh my God, we need to take him off the air.
I think removing history is, one should consider it very carefully.
Oh. Whoops. That's a bit embarrassing, isn't it? And do you know what the worst bit about that is? Is it assumes that everyone who is black must agree with your point of view, must agree that the statue should have been torn down and thrown in the river. And if you think that everyone of a certain skin colour thinks or behaves a certain way, doesn't that make you the racist, James?
But I don't want to throw petrol onto the fires that other people stoke and start at times.
Yeah, but you're going to anyway, aren't you?
Like this. It's a wonderful moment for racists, demagogues and racist agitators, because they can come out and start calling for riots or pretend that they're...
Or criminal vandalism.
...a warning about things that they're actually fomenting.
I mean, pretend that they're warning about things that they're actually fomenting. Could you not find a more perfect description of James O'Brien?
So while I have much sympathy for the argument that it should have been done legally and formally and through proper channels, they tried, and it didn't happen.
And it didn't happen, so we're just going to revert to mob rule and tear the thing down, because why not? Who's going to stand in our way? I mean, it's quite amazing. I've been listening to James O'Brien for like a few years now. It's incredible to see that he's tumbled so far down the rabbit hole that he's now on the side of criminal vandalism and a bunch of scoundrels who just decide that they're going to go around smashing things up because that's what they want to do. That's the side that James O'Brien has taken in this fight.
And it was put up in 1895.
Put up in 1895. Now, the thing about British people, in my opinion, is we're quite conservationist in nature. And I think the reason for that is because we have such a long history that if you want to try and remove some or change something historical, you're naturally going to get a lot of resistance to that. Just because we have such an old country and such an old culture that, like I said, we're conservationists in nature and we don't like seeing things change too quickly. And yeah, so it might have been an idea to get people's consent before ripping down historical monuments which have been stood for, what, 125 years, I think it was? 125 years, and they just tore it down and threw it in the river without asking anyone.
So I'm trying at the moment to distill my whole kind of working life into as simple and short questions as possible. And I think that the three favourites, the current top three contenders are, what are you frightened of? What are you really angry about? And how would you feel if it was the other way round? How would it feel if you were on the receiving end of the behaviours that you are troubled by, frightened of or angry about? So I don't know that the first two have much room today. What are you frightened of? You can have a crack at that if you want.
I'd love to. More criminal damage, more vandalism, more mob rule.
you really angry about?
What am I really angry about, right? The fact that a bunch of millennials, because they are definitely millennials, saw fit to go and destroy a piece of British history just because that's what they thought they would do. And what I'm particularly angry about, not the fact that they did it, because they're all morons anyway, but it's the fact that the entire media establishment is completely supporting these people in their act of criminal vandalism. And that's what makes me angry. I just, like I said, I can't believe we've arrived at this point where people like James O'Brien, who get on his national radio show and talk to, I don't know, millions of listeners, I think, every day, they're now advocating criminal vandalism and mob rule. That's what makes me angry. And like I said, it's so unreasonable that I now have to side with a 17th century slave trader. And I really don't want to do that, you know, because he was obviously an evil man. But I have to side with him. Or I have to side with his statue, at least. You know?
I mean, you can't really be angry that somebody whose fortune was built upon the backs of dead children. I suppose you could make an argument for saying that if they had any common sense, they wouldn't have ended up dying on slave boats, couldn't you? But no one would be that crass, I'm sure, in the current political climate. So you can't really be cross about the fact that a slaver has been removed from the public space.
Not a slaver, a statue, a historical monument. If a slaver was removed, like an actual person from... In fact, I still would be angry, because doesn't a slaver have the right to be in the public space? No? And again, now I have to defend slavers, actual slavers. They have that right to be in the public space. Unless they were supposed to be in prison or something.
Are you cross about the people who did it? Are you angry about the fact that something you can't quite describe has apparently been polluted or spoiled? Or have you not stopped to actually ask what you're angry about or what you're really frightened of? The third question for me is the killer. The absolute crux of this issue.
And this is where I'm going to absolutely pull James O'Brien's pants down.
Because I couldn't do it, and I'd be fascinated to know whether you can. So lots of black people live in Bristol, some of whom will be descendants of slaves.
All of whom would be offended by this statue, in James O'Brien's mind, because they all think the same thing.
And they would walk past that statue every day. And the question I asked myself yesterday was this. If I was black and I was walking through that park with my child, and my child asked who this was, and I explained who this was, and my child said, "Why is the statue still up, Daddy?" I wouldn't be able to answer.
It's got a very simple answer. The answer to that question is because not enough people have been persuaded that it should be removed. Because that is the way we do things in this country. We do things with the consent of the majority. And that's something that the left seems to have forgotten about, you know, with, say, Brexit, for example, the way that they try to frustrate it at every turn and calls for a second referendum and revoke Article 50 and this, that and the other. So if democracy doesn't go the way you want it to, which it hasn't for the left for quite a long time now, in fact, then you just stamp your feet and resort to criminality, I guess. But yeah, wouldn't that be an inspirational way of telling your child to go out and change people's minds, you know? You'd say to them, if you really want it removed, you need to persuade people why it needs to be removed. Because I'm sure most people, even black people, don't go around worrying about this statue in Bristol in their day-to-day lives. Most people don't even know what it represents. So, yeah. And the other thing, if I explained to my child that this man was a guy that went to Africa and took loads of people against their will and put them on the slave ships and did this, that, and the other, wouldn't you, as the child, think, well, thank God we don't live in that time anymore? But that's a point that just seems to go over most people's heads, including James O'Brien. And that's what I mean about the statue being a neutral statement of history, because that would be a good entry point into a conversation about slavery with your children. And not only that, but to mark the progress that we've made. You know, it's not just about the bad thing that happened, it's about the fact that we don't do that bad thing anymore. If someone put a petition in front of me that said we should remove this statue because it celebrates a 17th century slave trader, I'd sign it. But I cannot endorse criminal damage and vandalism. And the reason I can't endorse it is because A, you don't know when it's going to stop, and B, you don't know the motivations of the people doing it. You know, the motivations of the people doing it may not necessarily be good. And that's why we can't have mob rule. And it's now got to the point where I actually would like to see the right wing tear down Nelson Mandela's statue in London, just to give the left a taste of their own medicine. Just to remind the left why we do things the way we do things in this country, which is through reasoned debate. Because if you have mob rule, you don't know who the mob's going to be. That's the point. You don't know whether the mob are going to be virtuous. And I'm sure if the right wing tore down a statue of Nelson Mandela because he was black in London, I'm pretty sure James O'Brien wouldn't be very happy with it. But what would he be able to say? He wouldn't have a single leg to stand on. And like I said, it just goes to show how crazy we are, that I'm now at a point where I'm coming on Facebook and saying I would like to see Nelson Mandela's statue torn down or defaced or something in the way that Winston Churchill's one was, or this Edward Colston guy's was. Just to give the left a little reminder of why we don't resort to violence and criminality in this country. Do you see how people get pushed further into the right wing now?